All right, so I am sharing screen now so you all can see a little bit about my background. I love to see these different places around the world. When people ask me, so who are you? The first thing I generally will start with is I'm a person that has lived in well over 5 states by the time I was the age of 10. So you can see it's my resume. I love working with what I call game changers in hiding. Those are individuals oftentimes that do struggle with boundaries. Those are individuals that oftentimes what I say don't get the compensation or even the respect that they actually need as game changers in hiding. So I'm not going to go on and belabor my resumes. You can actually see here and see who I am. But what I wanted to do was just kick us off and go ahead and get started. So this is really the overview around having healthy boundaries. And as you look at this, one of the things that I want you to remember is that when we talk about healthy boundaries, I often hear my clients say, well, I don't have enough time. I really don't want to do it. I feel so guilty about saying no. And whenever I hear those things, I know that those are clues that there is some work to be done around boundaries. So as I look at the chat, I see the exact same thing. Sometimes I don't feel comfortable speaking up. Absolutely struggle with saying no, setting boundaries, delegating, and using my voice. I need to learn to say no. And one thing that I want to just stress before we go any further is that boundaries is not always about saying no. Boundaries oftentimes is about talking about what is accepted and what is not accepted. I'll give you a quick example. I have a teenage son who might get upset when it's time to turn off video games. So the behavior that he might exhibit is for him to stomp up the stairs. And so a boundary for me is to let him know what is okay and what's not okay. So I may say something to him like, it's okay for you to be upset that the video games are done, but what's not okay is for you to stomp up the stairs and have an attitude, right? So I'm giving some boundaries around behavior that is acceptable, but also talking about some things that potentially might not be acceptable. I'm going to pause for a moment, take a look at the chat. Struggles with saying no, which carries into boundary challenges. A big takeaway from today. No is a complete sentence, and I want to get comfortable with that. Yes, yes, yes. Getting comfortable. And that's another thing that we're going to talk about is how do we get comfortable being uncomfortable? How do we get comfortable being uncomfortable with boundaries? We're also going to talk a little bit about what healthy boundaries are, the connection with boundaries between your mind and your body, and also understanding what happens when we get activated by those who actually kind of encroach on what our boundaries are. All right. So with that being said, if there are any questions, just make sure you put those in the chat. I will be minding the chat as well as going back and forth with the slide deck. So again, just asking that you just extend a little bit of grace for me on that. And for any of you that just joined, please be sure to put your name in the chat, put your LinkedIn, because this is about connecting the power of women at work. So the reason that I put this agenda up again is for you to just see with a boundary, something as simple as putting an agenda up with your meeting lets individuals know what boundaries we can expect to have from a discussion standpoint in our meetings. So if you are hosting meetings, if you're having meetings and you don't have even just a sort of small agenda, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then that may be an issue that you're having as it relates to boundaries. The next thing I'm going to show is around group norms. So many of us, as we are, and we're going to tie this to work as well as our personal lives, but many of us who struggle with boundaries actually may struggle with boundaries because we don't necessarily put in what those norms are, right? And so if you don't have what those norms are, when people go outside of the boundaries, then what? I've often held facilitated sessions and there are these group norms, and then something happens and no one knows what to do. Well, outside of setting group norms, you also have to have what happens when we go outside of those group norms. Because remember when I gave the example of my son and I said to him, what's okay? So what's okay is with group norms, that we be brave, that we stay engaged, that I'm going to facilitate learning, and I'm going to encourage collaboration from each of you. But what's not okay is, right? So if I don't establish what's not okay, then when it happens, people are like, looking around sort of what happens in this setting, who's going to be the person or who's going to be the heavy to step in and make something happen. So I would encourage you in meeting settings, or even if it's a formal or informal setting, to make sure that people understand what those boundaries are. Let me just check chat for a moment. That makes sense. I need to be able to set boundaries with being left out. Yeah, I love that. All right. So we'll get into the purpose. Again, purpose is you chose this workshop for really some sort of specific reason. Not really sure for everyone. A lot of you put that in the chat. Maybe it's the first one on the list. I have no idea. Maybe we've met in the past. Maybe you just want to see a different facilitation style. But whatever the case is, I just want to say that I am glad that you are here. And the reason that I think this is so important is not just for people to find their voice, but because you are that important, right? And the minute that we make sure that we understand first that we are that important, it helps others to understand our importance, specifically related to boundaries. All right. So I love this visual. Don't cross this line, right? I had a grandmother that would say many, many years ago, give me 50 feet, back up, right? And when she would say that, we knew that that meant something happened. We had crossed the line, we had crossed the boundary. And each of us knows within our personal lives and even our professional lives when a boundary has been crossed. But I'll pause for a moment and just say, what is a boundary? So if we could just get some chat, we're actually going to go into some breakouts, but we'll use the chat before then. So anyone, just what does a boundary mean for you? Let's see. And I'll caution you all, I was a librarian many years ago, so I'm real comfortable with silence in the chat. Let's see. Anything I'm not comfortable with, love that. It means limitations. Yeah. Yeah. A line that does not get crossed. I love this. Sabri, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. That's it. The reason that I want to just double click on that for a moment is think about an imaginary line. So go back to when you were in social studies, right? Or geography class when you were in elementary or middle school. Your teacher probably showed you a map and explained that certain types of lines were used to show boundaries between states and countries. And sometimes there would be sort of this natural feature, either a river or something that would divide it, territory. But for the most part, it was really something that was not visible, right? And oftentimes in the real world, boundaries are not visible. And yet, even though we can't see boundaries, people accept that they're there and understand how far they can go before crossing into one another. And so another example I want to give is that, when you think about your skin, for example, the skin, right? That's a boundary. That's a protection for you, right? And so when you're trying to describe what a boundary is for individuals, I'm going to show you what a definition of it is. But just think about that, right? What does it mean to you? Is it a barrier, something that can be touched? Probably not. Is it a word that's spoken? Or is it just this imaginary line that we had, like when we were back in grade school and we were in geography? So I have something here. We're actually not going to do a poll, but I would just love if you would put the numbers in the chat. So where did you first learn about boundaries? Some of you may be thinking, I don't really understand boundaries. So I don't know where I learned about them. Could be your friends or parents. You actually saw people model what it meant to set good boundaries. Watching others, maybe that's in a work setting, could be a workshop, training book. All right, let's see what survey says. All right, I see a lot of 2s and 3s, watching others. Watching others. Yeah, friends and parents, right? So it doesn't sound like a lot of us have had any formal training on setting boundaries. So this session is just going to be a light session about what is boundaries, how do we establish boundaries, but a lot of this is also going to be about practicing. Practice, 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 right? In the words of the great basketball star, like who needs practice? Boundaries is something that we must practice, and it's best to practice really in a safe space. So let's go to what I call the definition of boundaries. And I put this up because you can go to Webster's, right? You can find a definition of boundaries. But when I think of boundaries, this is what I try to remember: being aware. So the first thing about a boundary is just awareness, right? Oftentimes we just float through life and we're not even aware of the things that we value. We're not even aware of the things that matter the most to us. And so when people encroach upon those, then we oftentimes say, hey, they've crossed the line. But the first thing is for us to be aware. And the first is of what is acceptable and normalized, saying no, right? So what is acceptable? That's the next thing. First, you have to be aware of self, values, what's important to you. And then the next thing is to understand what is acceptable. And then what are you normalizing? Because oftentimes something happens, we think, oh, it's not a big deal. I'm not going to say anything, right? You have a few friends that say, oh, let's go out for, drinks, dancing, happy hour, whatever the case is. And you really don't want to go, right? But you don't want to be that heavy that says no. Well, your boundary might be that, you know what? I'm on a weight loss plan, or I choose not to eat junk food right now, or I'd love to get some rest because I need to get rest so I can get up the next morning. But we don't set that boundary because what we think is, well, if I say no, gosh, that's just such a hard no, right? But maybe the no becomes, I would love to, hang out with you all, but unfortunately, I've made a commitment to self that I'm going to get some rest tonight. Something simple as that is a boundary. And we do it all the time, but we oftentimes don't think about that as a boundary. We think about boundaries oftentimes as those hard no's of like, no, this can't be done. So unacceptable and normalizing saying no. Do what is best for you, right? So if someone gets upset because there's something that you've asked them to do and you've clearly stated your boundaries, the one thing I would encourage you to do is remember that that is their business, not your business, right? You have to do what is best for you and know what is not your responsibility. So know it's not your responsibility to please others with your time and energy. And we're talking about this a little bit later. I love that. That is their business. That's one of the things that I practice saying, right? Is that's their business. And that doesn't make it a bad thing. It's not a put off. It's not to, make people feel bad or try to shame folks. But there are some things that are just other people's business. And it's not really our business to guard other people's, say, emotions or even their needs if it crosses a boundary. I'll pause for a moment because I've given you a lot to see if there are any questions that are here. Anything that arises? All right. Let's see. So there are different types of boundaries. And again, I'm one of those people, I do a lot of research and then I figure out what fits for me. So this type of boundary with 7 types of boundaries might be too many for you. Again, you can Google boundaries and you can find 5, you can find 6. But for me, these are 7 that really work. The mental, emotional, material, internal, conversational, physical, and time. And so we're going to take a moment a little bit later in the session to look at these and unpack them and figure out exactly what are they. But then specifically, what are some words that you may use around these specific types of boundaries? Is this new for folks, or have folks seen any sort of models or anything like that around boundaries? I know most of you said you have not received any formal training, but there were some of you that have gone through some workshops. New for you. Yeah, new one. Yeah. All right. It's the first time. Love that. All right. All right. So when I show the specifics in there, you may want to take a picture of it, or again, you can actually just go online and find those 7 different types. So what I'd like to do is put us in breakouts, and we're going to go in breakouts for about 15 minutes because anything less than that is really difficult for people to kind of get together. So let's see how this breakout feature works here. I am going to put, let's put 3 people in a room. And so we're going to regroup after, let's see, I like 16. That's a great number. So I'm not sure exactly where the link is that you'll have to go to, but once I put you in these breakouts, if you can still see the screen, then I'm not sure if it'll go in the breakout. So let me read this for you if you would take a picture. So think about a situation where a boundary was overstepped and just describe it to the group. What was going through your mind when this happened? What emotions did you feel in that moment, right? And remember, emotions, oftentimes we think of an emotion as just being one-sided. So we can be excited, but we can also be fearful at the same time. Those 2 emotions can live together. So example, your boss comes to you and tells you about a new project. They're excited about having you work on it. You are, again, excited about the project, but fearful that they may not give you the resources that you need. So those 2 things can actually live together. So just think about what did you feel? What were some of the emotions? And then how did your body react to it? And I want you to just sit in it for a moment, because oftentimes the only reaction that we respond to is the brain or a racing heart. Those two things get our attention like that. But some of us have sweaty palms. Some of us, our physical reaction is to sort of get nervous and think about things. Some of us scrolling, right? We start doing this finger action because our fingers have to move, and we start to go to the phone, pick up the phone and scroll a bit. So just think for a moment. This one might be the toughest one, the last piece, which is the body. But how did your body react when this occurred? So again, take a moment to look at these four. I'm actually going to put us in, let's give us 18 minutes, because you'll probably want to introduce yourselves. And there will be 3 people per room. Might be because it's not an even number to go in there. So you might actually have 4. So you'll see me back in 18 minutes. All right. Looks like everyone is back. My little thing says breakouts are ending in 22 seconds. So I think everyone is back. All right. Great session. Great session. All right. So I'd love to do what I call a firestorm chat. So just take 10 seconds. I'm going to put it in the chat here. I'm showing up as Ayana. I'm actually Ranieka. My voice doesn't normally sound like this. My name is not Ayana. You're like, who is this lady? But I'm logged in under Ayana, who's one of the other coaches. So I am Ranieka Weston. But what I want you to do is just take 10 seconds and think about what were some insights that came out of that. So just take 10 seconds, right? I'm going to put my timer on, and I'm going to call it a chat storm. So don't put anything in the chat yet. Just take 10 seconds. Really think about, what was an insight that came out of that, either for you or for someone else. We don't have to necessarily name the individual because it's not about the person. It might be about the story. All right. So on the count of 3, let's do a chat storm and just put it in the chat and tell me what was that like? What insights did you have? 1, 2, 3. All right. RESPECT. That was the theme, right? The rest of that says, find out what it means to me. And that's the piece that we're going to get into and talk about in our last and final breakout. Lots of stories. Be more direct, clear. Respect was the theme. Demanding respect for yourself and others. Say no. Clarity of communication. That is so important. We've not really talked about that a bit. Express yourself. Honor your boundaries. How to say no. Being able to push against leadership, right? And is it push with leadership or actually support leadership? Because you may need to support them so they can better support you. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. All right, having a great manager. Communication is key. Express the consequence of crossing the boundary ahead of time. That's right. So for instance, one of the things in the chat talked about pushing up against leadership. And so the connection there between that and being able to communicate the boundaries ahead of time is letting individuals know maybe the workload you're working on, and the consequence of something else coming in is that something else is not going to get done. Sounds very simple, but in practice, oftentimes a difficult thing. How important having your manager as an advocate in having others respect your boundaries, right? Something as simple as saying, I may not get to this project right now. What support can you provide me with delegating this to someone else? That's a boundary. I cannot get to this right now. That is the boundary, right? Asking for what you need is actually saying to that individual, how can you support me in being able to delegate this to other people? There's so many scenarios that fall under the microaggressions bucket, and it's so important to recognize boundaries for ourselves and strategically manage through them. Yes. I think it's Avion. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I love that. I want to +1, +2, +3 that as well, because oftentimes what happens with microaggressions is a boundary is crossed. And what do we do in that moment? I had a client the other day say to me, she had someone say to her, I don't know exactly the context, and really doesn't matter the context of what happened, but something to the effect, you don't have to put on your Compton bamboo earrings, right? That's a microaggression, right? So how do we come back from that? How do we express a boundary with that? And the boundary is really what is acceptable and what is not acceptable to say to me, right? And so it's okay for you to hear the passion in my voice. What's not okay is to have the microaggression that actually connects it to something that I'm not even aware or even sure that you understand the ramifications of what you said, right? And that's just me sort of coming off the cuff, but really first thinking about what was the boundary that was crossed. So let's get back into this. And what gets in the way? I'm gonna just share this. Oh, wait a minute. Did I click on the wrong thing? Oh no, I did not. Okay, hold on. Open share. I told you all I'm an expert at Zoom, but not so much of an expert in this space. But what gets in the way, right? And I think three things get in the way of us setting boundaries. The first one I think is our fingerprint. Some of you have seen this before. This is an identity wheel. I'm calling it our fingerprint because it's everything that makes up you as an individual. And so when you look at the identity wheel, there are so many things that impact us, stories that we still hold on to, experiences that we have that have been shaped by so many things in our lives. So as you look at that wheel, the first is race and ethnicity, right? And so when you think about boundaries being crossed, we just talked about microaggressions. There are times that you don't want to make waves or you don't want to call a thing every time you see a thing, meaning a microaggression, because how many times would you be asserting those boundaries with individuals? Age, right? Depending on where you are in the spectrum, whether you're a millennial, whether you're a boomer, that may have an impact on how you address boundaries, gender, national origin, sexual orientation, mental and physical ability, right? Um, Oftentimes when I look at this outer space here, I think, gosh, how does that shape my boundaries? How does that really shape who I am and what that means to me? Something as simple as appearance, right? So suppose you're an individual. I am not like well endowed, but if I were, I probably occasionally might wear a dress that might be, lower here, not too low for the corporate space. And so what if someone makes a comment about that, right? And so what kind of boundaries am I putting in place? And what kind of things am I not going to say to individuals because I'm afraid that something's going to happen from a boundary standpoint? So let's use that same example, right? So I'm not that well endowed. Let's say I was well endowed. And so when I go out, I always am covering. Let's use the opposite of that. I'm always covering because I don't have to set that boundary with people, right? Of people making comments and things like that. So that is a part of my identity. That may shape how I look at boundaries around appearance, right? We're not going to spend a lot of time here, but I would like for you to just take a look at this fingerprint or this identity wheel and find out what space in here for you has really shaped how you do or do not set boundaries, right? And I don't know if there's anything in the chat. I know for me, one of the things that really shaped the way I set boundaries is family. And that's going to be the next F. When I think about what gets in the way of setting boundaries, for me, it's family. And the family that we grow up in actually has its own cultural norms, the same as the business environments that we work in. And so I'm going to share something with you. I'm going to come off of this year, and I'm going to share something with you regards to family and why sometimes family can get in the way of us being able to set the boundaries that we want to share. So give me just a moment. Got my favorite family here. I'm going to have Bo actually talk to Dre about boundaries. Let's see. Yes, you can hear me. All right, I will just tell you about the video. I'll actually put the link in the chat. The thing that I love about this, let me put this on because my sound is better with this. All right. When we tested it yesterday, it worked, but it doesn't work now. All right. Just not the video. All right, I'm gonna just share this with you all, and you can take a look at it when you leave here if you want to look at it. But what I love about this is Bo is actually telling Dre that what, you have to set some boundaries with your mother, and you could just tell by his body language, even if you could not hear the sound, you could tell by his body language that he just was not comfortable with her telling him this. And she said it again, and he was like, I know, I know, I know. And then the next piece of this is really him setting boundaries with his mother. And if any of you watch this show, right, Blackish, you know how the mother on Blackish is. And so Dre has something that he wants to share. And he's like, no, 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 I got to set boundaries. I've got to set boundaries with my mother. And all of a sudden, here she comes. And as she's coming and saying this to him, she's like, well, who are you going to tell this to? And he's like, Mom, I've got to set boundaries with you. I can't tell you what it is. And then the end of the scene, she's like, oh, Jesus, help me. Oh, take me, right? All because Dre could not share this thing with her, and he was drawing a boundary. And so when you go back to that fingerprint, remember I shared that fingerprint with you. One of the fingerprints or parts of the piece that shapes our identity is our family. And so in the chat, if you would, I know you didn't get to see the video, but in the chat, anybody struggle with boundaries with just family, right? Maybe you're good at setting boundaries at home, but you struggle with setting boundaries with family. Anyone? I'm gonna put it in the chat. My goodness, yes, definitely, yes. Yeah. And a lot of that is because of the culture that has been set for us. It is also how we are viewed within our social circle, right? So think about when you are a professional and you step out of the house and you go to work, you are taking care of business. But oftentimes, the moment we step in with family, they have forgotten who we are, right? They've forgotten the fact that we are no longer that younger sister or that younger, niece or that child, right? We're still always our parents' children, but the way in which they interact with us as children is different. And if you have children, I would encourage each of you to begin to set boundaries with your children and teach your children how to set boundaries so that not only can they set boundaries with the outside world, but at some point they will begin to be able to set boundaries with you as well. I did until I started being vulnerable and setting values around my boundaries. Yes, thank you. That's one of the keys. I'm going to show a slide of that in just a minute, that, really establishing what your values are will help you lean into your boundaries, right? Because if it is truly a value of yours, and I'll give you an example. Oftentimes we say, oh, I just got to take work home with me. If I don't do it, who's going to do it? If my boss gets mad, right? And if I were to ask you your top values, many of us would say family. Yet if family is one of your top values, then how can you allow work to encroach on family? So some of you may say, you just don't understand. My job is so busy. The people are so demanding. What we have to do is be courageously authentic and consistently talk about what those values are and how they show up. So if family is a top value for you, I would ask you, how many people in your professional setting really understand that family is a top value? Not that just family is important, but it is truly a top value for you, right? Because think about many of us who worship on Sunday. If someone were to ask you to work on Sunday, if your faith is a top value of yours, you would say no. And you would be very much the one to push back on that. So I ask you to just think about what those values are. There's actually something called the VIA Values in Action. If you've never taken a values assessment before, and I guess what I'll ask, how many of you know your top values? And if you do, put them in the chat. If you don't know them, just say, I don't know them. And it's okay. How many of you actually know what your top values are? Anyone? I'll put what mine are. I don't remember what my fourth one is, but creativity, love of learning, and spirituality is there. Honesty. Yeah. Tracy, I love that. Can I give an example? I'm just going to double click on this for a minute with a couple of these to give examples. So I have a coach that I work with, and one of her top values is honesty. And when she said it, I'm like, well, does that mean I'm dishonest? Because that's not one of my top values that showed up. She is so honest that we were facilitating a session together. I never really spent that kind of time with her. We spent 2 days together in North Carolina. And I was presenting something, and I said, Becca, do you want to add anything? And she proceeds to say, I don't have anything to add, because I'll be honest, Ranieka, I kind of zoned out for a minute. That is true honesty, right? And throughout that time that I spent with her these 2 days, there were so many times where her honesty showed up. She was brutally honest, but not in a mean-spirited way. But because I knew honesty was one of her top values, I knew that the way in which she presented herself was honoring that value. And it's important when you work with people, especially when you're talking about boundaries, to really know your values and to get in touch with other people's values, right? I see someone say faith, family, integrity, right? And so when individuals encroach on your faith or your family, that may feel like an intrusion of boundaries, whereas for someone else, it's not sort of a big deal. It's not a big deal for me to work late. It's not a big deal for you to ask me to come to an event and I can't bring my children. It's not really a big deal. It doesn't mean I don't value my children. It's just maybe not one of my top values. Because if something is a top value, it will show up in everything that you do, everything that you say, and people will know that. All right. So the first we talked about was our fingerprint. That's what gets in the way. The second thing that can get in the way is our family. And then the third thing that I think gets in the way oftentimes is, and I'm going to share screen for just a moment. I am not a huge cat lover, but for those of you who are, you'll love this slide because I think fear gets in the way oftentimes. Fear, right? And so I love this depiction of this cat because this cat is like not really seeing everything for what it truly is. It's just sort of one eye is open and one eye is closed. And so oftentimes when we're thinking about a boundary, what eye is open and what eye is closed, right? So the open eye is oftentimes the fear, but the other eye of the possibility, right? The peace that we get with boundaries. You think about some of the anxiety that we have around things. Some of us get so anxious just simply looking at our calendars because we set no boundaries around our time, right? And a boundary, again, we'll talk about in just a moment, there are healthy boundaries and there are like unhealthy boundaries that people set oftentimes. So your question is sort of, well, what can I do about this, right? You've told me all these things about boundaries. That's nice, but like, what can I do about it? And the first thing that I would say that I would encourage each of you to do is to be clear and understand your why. And that goes into the values piece. Like, why is this this boundary so important to me? When I gave you that example of my son sort of stomping up the stairs, the reason that value is that boundary is so important to me is because I want to be the type of mother that allows her child to express their emotions. I do not want him to repress his emotions, right? I have two children. My oldest son, as a kid, I would always say to him, get control of your emotions, get control of your emotions. And so as a young adult, he doesn't have control of his emotions. His control of his emotions is to be emotionless, because that's basically what I would say to him when he would get sort of all in a rage. And so I said to myself, I don't want that with the second child. So having those boundaries to say it's okay to be emotional. What's not okay is for you to act out, right? So again, really assessing your why with your boundaries. The next thing that we want to think about is is clearly state your need or request, right? And so I didn't actually go through that with my son, but I may have said, I need you, right, to be able to express your emotions. What I don't need is for you then to act out, right? So think about your need or your request. Is there a values assessment test anyone can recommend? The VIA is one, and I will, give me just a second. When you all go back in the group, I'll put it back in there. It's excellent. It's free of charge. And what it does is it's about 25 values. And for those of you that are familiar with Strength Finders, it's loosely related to that, but it's not. It's not Clifton Strength Finders. But what I love about it is it actually gives you, it's not one of those where you pick 10 and then you narrow it down to 7 and then you narrow it down to 5. There are questions that you are asking. And so you can use this. There it is. Thank you. It's one that you could use with your team or even individuals within your family as well. Thank you for putting that in there, Tamisha. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And the last is to accept the discomfort that may arise, right? Accept the discomfort and accept the inner critic that may arise. Because what happens oftentimes when we set a boundary, then the inner critic comes in. Oh, if I tell them no, or if I say I'm not available, or if they come to me to borrow money and I have the money, then am I lying, right? So maybe it's not I don't have it, it's I don't have it within my budget to loan to you at this time, right? It doesn't mean I don't have it. It's just not within my budget to loan at this time. That's a boundary. That's not a lie. That's a boundary that you're setting maybe on loaning money. And there's going to be some discomfort with that because maybe the money that you were to lend to someone, you feel like they really, really needed it. But if you are very clear on your boundaries and your why, right? If your why is, I really don't have it in my budget, I have it, I could give it, but that's not what I budgeted for, right? Then that really helps. Yeah, the inner critic is real. I would encourage each of you. I'll give you another reference. This is one of my favorite books. It's called Playing Big by Tara Moore. And so you get it on Amazon or anywhere like that. But this is a great book around the inner critic and playing big. She also talks about the inner mentor. And oftentimes when we're doing a thing that has never been done in our eyes, meaning we haven't seen anyone do it, we go to a mentor and a mentor tries to help us. But the mentor may be talking to us about something that worked for them, whereas we have to find that inner mentor. So thinking about how to set boundaries, where's your inner mentor to help you get through some of this discomfort? And so the next thing, how do I do this? The values. We just talked about values. Healthy boundaries are always, 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 always rooted in your personal values, priorities, and needs. They're always rooted there. But oftentimes, again, if we don't know what they are, then we don't really know why this is bothering us, right? Why does this feel like a boundary that has been crossed? Why the person standing next to me, it didn't bother them, but for me, this really bothers me. It likely is connected to your priorities, your values, or even your own personal needs. The other thing is, I love this saying right here: clear is kind and unclear is unkind. I didn't invent this. This is a Brene Brown saying. It's one of the things that I really love about what she says is that oftentimes if we are asked to do something, we give this sort of convoluted excuse, so we, wrestle within ourselves. But if we're just clear with the individual, clear is kind. Because the person on the receiving end truly understands what's going on. And when it's not clear, it's not kind to the person because they are likely in a place of trying to figure out what it is we're trying to say to them, try to figure out making sense of what something is. And so here's the response. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. I didn't realize this was getting smaller for you all. Hopefully you can see it. All right. Thumbs up if you can see it. All right. That's the inner critic response. So I think that's still a thumbs up. So one of the things I want to talk about with that response is really going back to those 7. Remember, we talked about those 7 boundaries, right? And so you got to make sure that you are clear. You have to make sure that your values are there, right? And you've got to make sure that you check in with your body. The other thing I want to say before I get to the response, so if I had a drum roll, I'd have the drum roll right here. But what I want to say is, are your boundaries too weak or too rigid? So before we work on what is the response, how do we say a thing when we feel like a boundary has been crossed or we need to establish a boundary? Rigid boundaries are rooted in difficulty trusting, right? Inflexible rules about what you will do and what you will not. So we know people who establish boundaries and they are so rigid. They are so rigid. And depending on the space or the individual that you're with, you might need to have a little bit more rigidity in your boundaries. But if all of your boundaries, the way that you're known, your brand is that you are rigid with your boundaries, you probably want to look at how do you then establish some healthy boundaries. A lot of times, the rigid boundaries are rooted in a need to feel in control. If I don't feel like I'm in control because I'm not establishing these boundaries, as I said earlier about my grandmother with that give me 50 feet and relatives saying things like that, it was really about them being in control. And when they felt like they no longer had control, that's when they stepped in and that's when those rigid boundaries happen. And it shows up in parenting, right? You feel like you've set a boundary, right? There's a bedtime, there's a this, there's a that with the child. And then that person crosses it, right? And so we get rigid with that boundary. And oftentimes we get that way because we feel like we've lost some control, or we may feel misunderstood or even cut off, right? And so in boundary setting, there's a piece of vulnerability there. If you're not setting healthy boundaries, you're probably not being vulnerable. You're probably just being rigid. Healthy boundaries are about being assertive, asking for what you want and need, being clear about how you want to be treated and how others should treat you. And also sharing appropriate information. So sometimes we set a boundary and then we have to tell our whole life story about why we're not going to do something. Just sharing enough information that is appropriate, right? And you establish what is appropriate. So it's not that that other person needs to know more. If they do, they'll ask a question, but just sharing what is appropriate is a way to establish healthy boundaries. And then many people have weak boundaries. They got boundaries, but they're really weak. They're passive. They don't ask for what they need. And oftentimes, if we were to take sort of a bird's eye view or to step up on the balcony, we would actually see people being mistreated when they set weak boundaries. Weak boundaries also come because we're unsure of what really matters to us. And so if something really matters to you, if you don't set that boundary, again, that's likely going to be a trigger. And as soon as someone oversteps that boundary, there's going to be a challenge with that. So let's look at a couple of responses, right? And we're going to use all of these 7, and then we're going to take one of these 7 to do a sort of a personal inventory. So the 7 types of boundaries. The first is mental, freedom to have your own thoughts, values, and opinions. Oftentimes when we're talking about family, especially if there's a pecking order with power in a family, right? Like who's the matriarch or the patriarch within the family, times our opinions may not be respected, and we actually may be encroaching on other people's boundaries because we may be the more senior person. And a simple way to do that, if you feel that, is to say, I respect your perspective, although I do not agree. And we say that all the time, but we don't realize that is a boundary that we're giving to an individual. We're letting them know that I can filter in what you're saying. It's okay for you to have an opinion, but it's also okay for us to understand that I don't agree with that, right? And so again, that's tough to do in certain situations, especially if there's some sort of power or pecking order there. The second is emotional self-regulation, regulation, energy, thinking about self versus others, and saying something as simple as much as I want to support you right now, I just don't have the additional emotional capacity, right? Because that's oftentimes what happens. Someone gives us, they sort of dump on us, and we don't set that imaginary line that we talked about. That is something that was established in elementary and middle school when we were looking at maps. And so what happens is people dump and we don't give a response. Something as simple as saying, I just don't have the emotional capacity for that right now, right? And maybe it's something like, in addition to that, saying to the person, what other support can I provide? Right? So I can't give you that emotional support, but maybe there's other support that you could provide a person. Maybe the person says, you know what? The support that you could provide is just letting me know that you're praying for me. Or maybe it's that you'll check in on me in a couple of days, right? Maybe you can't give it to that individual right in that moment. The next is material, right? This one is in the order is flipped. And so when you think about that monetary, we kind of talked about that, like really setting some boundaries around finances and what we are willing to give to others and not get willing to give to others. The next is the internet. How many of us put boundaries around that, right? Do we put boundaries around that? Right? Do we say, I've been on social media all week, I've been on social media today, I'm going to have to put a boundary around that. Someone sends us something, we feel the immediate need to go look at it and send them back something to say, oh, that was funny or that was interesting, right? How many times can we say to that person, thanks for sending this, I normally don't check social media except once a week, or I'll be checking it this evening, I'll take a look at it then, right? So that's a new one. That's one that we don't have to think about, but there are boundaries that need to be set there. Yes, I use focus time, love that, but Apple makes it so easy to bypass my limit. I need to do better. The first thing is noticing, Taylor. I think that's the first thing when we start talking about how do we find our voice and just let go, is for us to start to begin to notice. All right. The next is physical, right? That was pretty easy, right? Asking someone, I don't hug, right? It's no offense, but I prefer not to hug people I do not know, right? That sounds pretty like cut that off, but guess what? You don't have to worry about it again, right? And if you say that, and I also think we're talking about this from a professional standpoint, but even children, some of you may have heard there's more work and more conversation around in our community, especially, where we have a lot of aunties and cousins that aren't necessarily blood related, go give your auntie a hug, go this, go that, And so giving your children the ability to be able to say, I prefer not to hug people that I don't know, and then extending their hand for a handshake. Like, what could be more adult like than to have a child really establish those boundaries, but still be connected by touch, but not be connected by the hug? And the next is time, how much time you spend with someone or something, doing something. I can only stay for 30 minutes, and then holding fast to that boundary. Taylor talked about the use of her phone. Like, literally, if there are people or meetings that you have, actually setting a timer and having the timer to go off and say, 30 minutes is up, would love to spend more time. But in the beginning, I mentioned that the only time that I have is really 30 minutes today. If we could reschedule, that would be great, right? Again, we talk about teaching people how to treat us. How we use our time and the boundaries we set around that time is so important. All right, so here's the practice, right? We'll take a couple of moments for this, and then I'm going to throw you in groups for just a moment so you get a chance to practice. You get a big project. I think I mentioned this earlier. It comes on your desk, and you're thinking, how do I turn this away, right? I feel this feeling of excitement, but I also feel this dread because I've got so much going on. So here are a couple of things that we may want to practice, right? The first is, thanks so much for thinking of me for this collaboration. This isn't the right direction for me right now, so I must decline, right? How many of us are actually given projects that don't actually increase our ability to scale as a leader, right? And when I say leader, it has nothing to do with if you lead a team or if you're an individual contributor, but oftentimes we're just given something, right? And so your boss may come back and say you can't decline, but at least you've established that boundary of saying this isn't the right direction, right? And they may say, what do you mean by the right direction? And then that opens up a conversation about your development in the projects that you're being assigned. The next says, usually I'm not asked to work on something like this. I will need your support in delegating a portion of this to others. Because sometimes we don't have the ability to delegate to others, right? So actually asking for that support, building that boundary, and then asking for that support. The next one, this is a great project. Unfortunately, I just don't have capacity right now. What is the risk for someone else to take this on? Thanks for that offer, but I'm already committed, right? When I hear people say that, sometimes it feels like, ooh, in my body, but in their body, it probably feels very freeing. And remember what we talked about, it's their business, not yours. So if someone says that to me and in my body, I feel like, whoo, that was a serious boundary. That's my business. That's not theirs. All right. Struggle with delegating. Yes. Ask for support. Ask for support if you struggle with delegating, right? Even if it's having that conversation with the person that you report into to say, can we role play this? Or even figuring out, why are you delegating? Because sometimes we struggle with delegating because we don't know why we're delegating something to a person. But if it's about that individual's growth, say that. If it's because you need the space and the capacity to be able to think and do because that's what your role is, then don't be afraid to do that. Even with colleagues, saying why, your why. Remember, we talked about that being so important. So we've only got, like 15 minutes. So I'm going to put us in a 10-minute breakout. List 3 ways to create a boundary to prevent this from occurring next time. So think about what happened before when you were talking about that boundary. Think about what you learned from that experience, and then think about the challenge that you may have in enforcing that boundary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create new breakouts, and we're going to regroup after 10 minutes. So this one's going to be pretty quick. All right. All right. Welcome back, everyone. All right. As you look at this picture, it looks like we're all back. All right. I want to do another firestorm chat before we get out of here, and I promise I'll get you out on time. But there's an image down there at the bottom, and this woman is like, she's lost it, right? And when we see this, it looks like we can rest assured that someone has stepped across the boundary. So what is one of the ways? Just take 10 seconds, because you all just talked about it in the group. Just take 10 seconds and tell ways to create a boundary to prevent you from doing this, right? If we could see you in this space, what's one of the ways that you can prevent getting to this place? Anyone? Let's see. Right. Clearly point out roles and responsibilities. Yes. There's another there's another quote, and it won't outside of clear as kind. Oh, it won't come to me. It's a concept, paint dry. I don't know how many have heard this, but paint dry means I'm finished, right? And so when people say I'm finished, does that mean I'm finished and we'll come back to it? Like we all kind of have an interpretation of what that means, but I would encourage you, especially if you work on teams, to really expand upon what does finish mean? Because finish for me may mean I am done. This is not coming across my desk again. Someone else is responsible for it. Finish for someone else means I'm finished, but we'll come back together and we'll take a look at it. And what that may mean for you, if you're the next person to receive this, is now this person's going to come back and we're going to talk about it again. I thought they were finished with it. So really establishing roles and responsibility. And what does it mean when I'm responsible for something? What does it mean when you're responsible for something? So thank you for putting that in the chat. Establish the boundaries, walk away. Yes, Jacqueline, how many of you have any sort of practice that is related to meditation? And taking some deep breaths. And sometimes clearly if a boundary has been crossed, literally saying your name, right? So a boundary has been crossed and you literally either say it out loud or say to yourself, Ranieka, take a moment to breathe, right? And just taking a couple of inhales and taking a couple of exhales, right? And that in and of itself will slow down the heart rate, which actually is more likely to slow down that triggering feeling that you have. Acknowledge future expectations, acknowledge what's being asked, and carve out communication. Yes. So the last thing as we close out, as we started this journey, we talked about finding your voice. And so oftentimes when we're setting boundaries, it can feel like we are on stage, right? And the person, all eyes are on us when we say this thing because we become uncomfortable with the boundaries that we've set. But I would encourage you to look at this picture a little bit differently and think about it in three regards. The first is the energy, the power source. So we've got to get the energy or the power source in our bodies to be able to create these boundaries. And one of the ways to do that, again, I keep going back to values, going back to your values, going back to what's important to you. Those are the things that will energize you. The next thing is to amplify your voice, right? Because oftentimes we set these weak boundaries and they're not really clear to people. They don't really know exactly what we're saying. And then the last piece is to use your microphone. So if you imagine someone who is standing up singing, they practice when no one is around. They practice when no one is listening. So actually going back through, and not from an inner critic perspective, but actually building that mental muscle to think about, when was the last time that a boundary was crossed? Was I clear? Did I understand my why? And did I actually let the person know what the expectation was and what the boundary was that they crossed? So actually practicing that almost as if you were a singer standing there at the microphone. So again, I want to thank each of you. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. Here's my website. Again, I'm Ranieka Weston. It probably is showing up as Ayana Costin. What I'd love, again, to get another firestorm of chat. And just tell me an intention, right? So one intention, and some of you have that, walk away, establish boundaries. But what is your intention when you leave here? What is the thing that if you did connect with me on LinkedIn, I would check in with you within a week, 2 weeks at the most, and you'd say, Ranieka, thanks for checking in. That was my intention and I'm making good on it. So again, take a couple of seconds and then let's just firestorm that in the chat. Thank you, Whitney. Complete survey about boundaries and restate them clearly. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And the survey was about your values. The values will help then link into the boundaries. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week. And it was a pleasure seeing each of you.